What if the man who built machines capable of outrunning death spent his entire life trying to escape a grief he could never leave behind? Before we enter those gates, if you have found your way to this channel, consider staying. Your presence here, your subscription, brings us closer to 1,000 and to telling more stories like this one. Now, let us return to Modena. August 14th, 1988, a Sunday. The Italian summer had reached its peak, and in the flat lands of Emilia-Romagna, the heat pressed down on the city like a closed hand. Modena lay quiet beneath the afternoon sun. The streets near Viale Trento e Trieste were nearly empty, shutters drawn against the light, the hum of distant traffic barely audible. Behind an unassuming gate, past a modest garden lined with cypress trees, stood a house that had witnessed decades of triumph, tragedy, and deliberate silence. Inside, Enzo Anselmo Ferrari lay in his bed. He was 90 years old. His body, which had endured nearly a century of ambition, had finally begun its withdrawal from the world. The room was dim, the curtains pulled against the glare. A clock ticked somewhere in the stillness. There were no cameras, no journalists waiting at the door, no grand procession of mourners. The man who had shaped one of the most recognizable names in automotive history chose to die as he had lived, on his own terms, shielded from the world he had both courted and resented. The official announcement would not come until 2 days later. His death, it was said, occurred peacefully in the presence of only his closest family. The funeral, held in the Cathedral of Modena, was a private affair, invitation only, closed to the public. His body was interred beside his son, Alfredo, known as Dino, in the small cemetery of San Cataldo. The world learned of his passing through brief communiques, stripped of detail. No extended eulogies were published. No interviews were granted. The house on Viale Trento e Trieste fell into a deeper quiet, as though it had been waiting for this moment all along. But even in death, Enzo Ferrari remained elusive. The simplicity of the official narrative obscured a more complex reality. Why had the announcement been delayed? Why had the funeral been conducted with such haste and secrecy? And why, in the years that followed, did so few details emerge about his final days, his final words, or the precise circumstances of his passing? Those who had known him understood. Enzo Ferrari had spent a lifetime constructing walls, around his factories, around his legacy, and most of all, around himself. The house in Modena was not merely a residence. It was a fortress of privacy, a space where the public myth of the racing titan gave way to the private reality of a man defined by loss. The death of his son Dino, 32 years earlier, had been the wound that never healed. Dino had died at 24, taken by muscular dystrophy after years of suffering. Enzo had watched his only legitimate heir fade away, had held his hand in those final hours, and had emerged from that experience transformed. Some said broken, others said hardened. What is certain is that after 1956, Enzo Ferrari became a man who trusted no one fully, who allowed no one too close, and who channeled his grief into an obsessive pursuit of victory on the racetrack. The house itself bore the marks of this transformation. Visitors who were granted entry, and they were few, described an atmosphere of controlled austerity. The furnishings were modest, the decor spare. There were no ostentatious displays of wealth, no trophies lining the walls. Photographs of Dino were present, but displayed quietly, almost reverently. The room spoke not of celebration, but of containment, as though the space had been designed to hold something in, rather than to welcome anything from outside. Enzo rarely left. In his final years, his world shrank to the distance between his bedroom and his office. He continued to oversee the racing team, issuing directives by telephone, receiving reports from engineers and drivers who made the pilgrimage to Modena. But he no longer traveled to the circuits. He no longer stood in the pits, watching his machines tear around the track. The roar of engines reached him only through the voices of others. And yet, even in this withdrawal, his control remained absolute. Nothing happened at Ferrari without his knowledge. No decision was made without his approval. The company, the team, the drivers, all orbited around him like planets around a dying sun, drawn by a gravity they could not escape. On that August afternoon, when Enzo Ferrari drew his last breath, the world outside continued as it always had. The factories in Maranello kept running. The mechanics kept working. The next race was already being prepared. But inside the house on Viale Trento e Trieste, something had ended that could never be rebuilt. The man who had made speed into a religion had finally stopped moving. Enzo Ferrari was born on February 18, 1898, in a modest house on the outskirts of Modena. The official records would later state February 20th, a discrepancy caused by a snowstorm that delayed his father's journey to the municipal registry. From the very beginning, even the facts of his existence were subject to revision. His father, Alfredo, operated a small metal fabrication workshop, producing sheds and canopies for the Italian state railway. It was not a prosperous business, but it was steady, rooted in the pragmatic industriousness of the Emilian working class. His mother, Adalgisa, managed the household with the quiet authority common to women of her generation. Enzo was the second son. His older brother, also named Alfredo, was expected to inherit the family trade. The Ferrari household was not one of luxury, but neither was it impoverished. What it lacked in wealth, it compensated for in proximity to the emerging mechanical age. The sound of engines, the smell of oil and iron, the rhythm of machines. These were the textures of Enzo's childhood. He would later recall watching his father work, observing the transformation of raw metal into functional objects, and feeling even then a fascination with the marriage of force and precision. In 1908, when Enzo was 10 years old, his father took him and his brother to a motor race in Bologna. It was a circuit event, loud and dangerous. The cars little more than engines bolted onto frames, driven by men who seemed to Enzo like gladiators from another age. He would remember that day for the rest of his life. The dust, the noise, the smell of burning fuel, and above all, the sensation of speed as something almost supernatural, something that could lift a man beyond the limitations of his birth. The trajectory of his youth, however, was not marked by triumph. In 1916, during the First World War, both his father and his brother died within months of each other. Alfredo Sr. from pneumonia, Alfredo Jr. from the after effects of illness contracted during military service. Enzo, barely 18, found himself alone, the sole survivor of his immediate family, the inheritor of a workshop he had no interest in running. He enlisted in the army, was assigned to a mule shoeing unit, and contracted a severe case of influenza during the epidemic of 1918. He nearly died. When he emerged from the military hospital, weak and disoriented, the world he had known was gone. The workshop had been sold. His family was buried. And Italy itself was convulsing through the aftershocks of war, revolution threatening from the left, reaction gathering on the right. It was in this void that Enzo Ferrari began to build himself anew. He traveled to Turin, seeking work at Fiat, and was refused. He drifted to Milan, took odd jobs, and eventually found employment as a test driver for a small automobile manufacturer called CMN. It was menial work, but it placed him behind the wheel. And behind the wheel, Enzo discovered something that would define the rest of his life: control. He was not a naturally gifted driver. His reflexes were adequate, his technique competent, but he lacked the instinctive recklessness that separated the great racers from the merely good. What he possessed instead was an understanding of machines, how they behaved, how they failed, and how they could be made to perform beyond their apparent limits. He listened to engines the way a physician listens to a heartbeat, diagnosing weakness, anticipating collapse. By 1920, he had joined Alfa Romeo as a driver and increasingly as a liaison between the factory and the racing world. He won races, though never the most prestigious ones. His victories were regional, secondary, the kind that built reputation without attracting legend. But Enzo was not interested in being a legend on the track. He was interested in something more durable, power over the machines themselves. In 1929, he founded Scuderia Ferrari, ostensibly a racing team, but in reality an independent entity that prepared and entered Alfa Romeo cars in competition. It was an arrangement that suited both parties. Alfa Romeo gained a dedicated racing operation without the expense of running one directly. Enzo gained autonomy, the freedom to select drivers, to modify cars, to build an organization that answered ultimately to him alone. The Scuderia operated out of Modena, first from rented premises, then from a building on Viale Trento e Trieste that Enzo acquired in the early 1930s. This would become the house, the residence that doubled as headquarters, the private space that was never entirely separate from the public enterprise. Even then, Enzo understood that boundaries could be useful, that the blurring of home and work created a kind of fortress, a place where he could control who entered and who was kept outside. Through the 1930s, the Scuderia grew. Enzo signed talented drivers, Tazio Nuvolari, Giuseppe Campari, Achille Varzi, men whose names would become synonymous with the golden age of European racing. He cultivated relationships with engineers, with sponsors, with the political figures whose favor could open doors or close them. He learned to navigate the treacherous currents of fascist Italy, accepting patronage without becoming a true believer, maintaining enough distance to survive whatever came next. And something always came next. That was the lesson Enzo had learned in his youth, watching his family disappear one by one. Nothing was permanent. Nothing was safe. The only protection was to keep moving, to keep building, to keep control so tightly wound that no external force could unravel it. By the end of the decade, he had transformed himself from a failed driver into the most influential figure in Italian motorsport. The house in Modena had become a center of gravity, drawing engineers and drivers and journalists into its orbit. But Enzo himself remained at the center, watchful, calculating, already preparing for the next transformation, the one that would carry his name beyond Alfa Romeo, beyond Italy, into a future he alone could see. In 1932, Enzo Ferrari's first son was born. He was named Alfredo, after the grandfather and uncle who had died 16 years earlier, but from the beginning, everyone called him Dino. The boy arrived into a household already defined by its contradictions, a home that was also a headquarters, a marriage that functioned more as an arrangement than a union, and a father whose capacity for affection was as guarded as his capacity for control. Enzo had married Laura Dominica Garello in 1923. She was a practical woman, sharp-tongued and fiercely protective, who understood from the start that she would never be the center of her husband's world. The cars came first. The races came first. The Scuderia, with its endless demands and crises, came first. Laura accepted this hierarchy, or at least endured it, channeling her considerable will into managing the domestic sphere that Enzo largely ignored. The birth of Dino shifted something in that calculus. Enzo, who had lost his own father and brother before he was fully grown, now had an heir, a continuation of the name, a vessel for the ambitions he himself might not live to fulfill. Photographs from those early years show a rare softness in Enzo's face when he holds the boy, a vulnerability he permitted himself with almost no one else. But the softness was always shadowed. By the late 1930s, it became clear that Dino was not a healthy child. He tired easily. His muscles did not develop as they should. Doctors were consulted, specialists summoned to the house in Modena, but the diagnosis remained elusive for years. It was not until the late 1940s that the condition was finally identified: Duchenne muscular dystrophy, a degenerative disease with no cure and no treatment. The prognosis was stark. Dino would weaken progressively. He would likely not survive past his 20s. Enzo received this news in the manner he received all catastrophic information, with silence followed by action. If his son could not be saved, then his son's life would be made meaningful. Dino, despite his physical limitations, showed an aptitude for engineering. He understood engines intuitively, could discuss valve timing and compression ratios with a fluency that surprised even the technicians at the factory. Enzo encouraged this, bringing Dino into the technical heart of the operation, treating him not as an invalid, but as a collaborator. In the early 1950s, Dino worked alongside the engineer Vittorio Giano on the development of a new racing engine, a V6 configuration that would prove revolutionary. The engine bore Dino's conceptual fingerprints, his ideas about efficiency and power delivery translated into metal and motion. Enzo ensured that everyone knew this. The engine would carry the name Dino. The cars it powered would carry the name Dino. His son's legacy was being constructed in real time, a monument built from aluminum and steel. But time was not generous. By 1955, Dino could no longer walk unaided. He was confined to the house in Modena, his world shrinking to the rooms where he had grown up, the garden he could see from his window, the visits from engineers who brought blueprints for him to review. Enzo visited him daily, sometimes sitting in silence, sometimes discussing technical matters as though nothing were wrong. The father, who had difficulty expressing emotion, found refuge in the language of machines, a vocabulary that required no confession of fear or grief. On June 30th, 1956, Dino Ferrari died. He was 24 years old. The funeral was held in Modena, attended by the racing community, by engineers and drivers who had known the young man, by the workers from the factory who had watched him grow up. Enzo stood at the graveside, his face unreadable, his posture rigid. He did not weep in public. He did not speak. When the ceremony ended, he returned to the house on Viale Trento e Trieste and closed the door behind him. What happened inside that house in the days and weeks that followed remains largely unknown. Enzo did not discuss his grief. He did not take time away from the factory. He did not seek comfort from friends or family. What he did was work, harder, longer, with a ferocity that alarmed even those who thought they knew him. The racing season continued. The cars were prepared. The drivers were instructed. And Enzo presided over all of it, a man who had transformed his mourning into momentum. But something had changed. Those who worked closely with him noticed a new coldness, a withdrawal that went beyond his usual reserve. He became more demanding, more critical, less tolerant of failure. Drivers who made mistakes were dismissed without sentiment. Engineers who disappointed him were reassigned or let go. The Scuderia, which had always been rigorous, became ruthless. Some attributed this to the natural evolution of a competitive enterprise. Others saw it as the manifestation of a wound that would never heal. Enzo had invested everything in Dino, not just love, but hope, the belief that something of himself would continue beyond his own death. That investment had been annihilated, and in its place there was only the work, the cars, the endless pursuit of victory that could never compensate for what had been lost. The house in Modena became a shrine of sorts. Dino's room was preserved, his belongings left untouched, his photographs displayed in the spaces where Enzo spent his days. Visitors who were permitted inside reported an atmosphere of suspended time, as though the residence existed in a perpetual 1956, waiting for a return that would never come. And Enzo, who had once dreamed of building a dynasty, now understood that he was building something else entirely. Not a legacy for his son, but a monument to his absence. The cars that bore the Ferrari name would carry that weight forward, year after year, victory after victory, each triumph shadowed by the knowledge of what it had cost. The factory in Maranello had opened in 1947, a few kilometers south of Modena, rising from the rubble of a building destroyed by Allied bombing during the war. It was here that the first car to bear the Ferrari name was constructed, the 125S, a small sports car with a V12 engine that announced Enzo's ambitions to anyone who cared to listen. But the factory was never meant to replace the house. The two existed in parallel, serving different functions in the architecture of control that Enzo was constructing around himself. Maranello was for production, for the noise and chaos of manufacturing, for the mechanics and engineers who labored under fluorescent lights. The house in Modena was for decisions, for the meetings that determined who would drive, who would be hired, who would be cast out. Enzo moved between the two like a sovereign traveling between palaces, never fully belonging to either, always maintaining the distance that authority required. By the late 1950s, Ferrari had become synonymous with victory. The cars dominated at Le Mans, at the Mille Miglia, at circuits across Europe and South America. The prancing horse emblem, inherited from a World War I flying ace and adopted by Enzo as his personal symbol, appeared on the hoods of machines that seemed to exist at the very edge of what was mechanically possible. Drivers who piloted Ferraris became celebrities, their names spoken with reverence in cafes from Milan to Buenos Aires. But behind the trophies and the headlines, a different reality prevailed. Enzo ran his organization with an autocracy that tolerated no dissent. He played drivers against each other, fostering rivalries that he believed sharpened their competitive instincts. He dismissed engineers who questioned his judgment, regardless of their talent or their years of service. He cultivated an atmosphere of perpetual uncertainty, where no one's position was ever secure, where loyalty was tested and retested until it either hardened into submission or shattered into departure. The house in Modena was the stage for much of this maneuvering. Drivers summoned to meet with Enzo would arrive at the gate on Viale Trento e Trieste, often waiting in the garden until the appointed hour, sometimes longer. The wait was deliberate, a demonstration of hierarchy, a reminder that access to Enzo was a privilege, not a right. When they were finally admitted, they entered a space that offered no comfort. Spare furnishings, dim lighting, and Enzo himself seated behind a desk, his dark glasses obscuring his eyes, his expression impossible to read. The glasses had become his signature. Enzo claimed they were necessary due to a sensitivity to light, a consequence of illness in his youth. But they served another purpose as well. They created a barrier, a surface that reflected the gaze of anyone who tried to meet his eyes. Conversations with Enzo were negotiations conducted in partial blindness, the other party never certain whether they were being assessed, dismissed, or simply ignored. His management of drivers was particularly brutal. Men who had risked their lives for the team, who had delivered championships and shattered records, could find themselves discarded with little warning. Juan Manuel Fangio, widely considered the greatest driver of his era, drove for Ferrari in 1956 and departed after a single season, frustrated by the internal politics and Enzo's unwillingness to provide consistent support. Sterling Moss, another legend, never drove for Ferrari at all, the negotiations collapsing over issues of control that neither man was willing to concede. Those who remained learned to navigate Enzo's moods, his preferences, his unspoken rules. They learned that public criticism was unforgivable, that private complaints would be reported back to him by the network of informants he maintained within the organization. They learned that success on the track brought only temporary favor, that a single failure could erase years of loyalty. And they learned, above all, that Enzo's grief over Dino had not softened him, but calcified him, transforming a difficult man into an unapproachable one. The year 1961 brought tragedy of a different order. During the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, the Ferrari driver Wolfgang von Trips collided with another car on the second lap. His vehicle was launched into the crowd, killing von Trips and 15 spectators. It was one of the deadliest accidents in the history of motorsport, and it occurred on Italian soil, in front of Italian fans, with an Italian car at its center. Enzo did not attend the race. He rarely attended races anymore, preferring to receive reports by telephone at the house in Modena. When the news reached him, he retreated into silence. The official statements were issued by subordinates. The legal proceedings were handled by lawyers. Enzo himself remained invisible, shielded by the walls he had spent decades constructing. Critics accused him of cowardice, of refusing to face the consequences of the machines he built. Supporters argued that his absence was a form of self-protection, that the intensity of his emotional investment in the cars and drivers made direct confrontation unbearable. What is certain is that after Monza, Enzo's withdrawal deepened. He ventured out less frequently, he delegated more responsibilities to trusted lieutenants, and he spent more time in the house, surrounded by the photographs of Dino, the trophies of past victories, and the silence that had become his preferred companion. The public saw Ferrari as a symbol of Italian excellence, a triumph of passion and engineering over the industrial might of Britain and Germany. The private reality was a man increasingly isolated by his own success, a patriarch without an heir, a builder of dynasties who had watched his only legitimate son die and who now presided over an empire that felt, to him, like an elaborate form of penance. There was another son. His name was Piero, and for the first 27 years of his life, he existed in the shadows, unacknowledged by the man who had fathered him. Piero Lardi was born in 1945, the product of Enzo's long affair with Lina Lardi, a woman who had worked in the Ferrari offices during the war. The relationship was not a secret. Such things rarely were in the small world of Modena's industrial circles, but it was never spoken of publicly. Enzo maintained his marriage to Laura, continued to live in the house on Viale Trento e Trieste, and visited Lina and their son in a separate residence, leading a double life that required constant management and deliberate compartmentalization. Piero grew up knowing who his father was, but forbidden from claiming him. He could not use the Ferrari name. He could not visit the house in Modena openly. He could not attend events where his presence might embarrass the legitimate family or provoke questions that Enzo was unwilling to answer. He was, in the language of the era, a natural son, a category that carried legal limitations and social stigma in Catholic Italy. The situation was further complicated by Dino's death. With his legitimate heir gone, Enzo faced a succession crisis. The Ferrari company, the racing team, the legacy he had spent his life constructing, all of it now lacked a clear inheritor. Laura, who had endured decades of her husband's infidelity, refused to accept Piero as a solution. She would not permit the son of her rival to claim what she believed belonged to her family, even if that family had been reduced to herself alone. For years, the impasse held. Enzo continued to see Piero privately, providing for him financially, involving him gradually in the operations at Maranello, but the formal recognition that would have legitimized his position remained withheld, trapped between Enzo's desire for continuity and Laura's implacable opposition. The resolution came only after Laura's death in 1978. Within months, Enzo legally recognized Piero as his son, granting him the Ferrari surname and positioning him as the heir apparent. Piero was 33 years old. He had waited more than 3 decades for an acknowledgement that most children receive at birth. The house in Modena absorbed this transition with characteristic discretion. There were no public announcements, no celebrations, no interviews explaining the change. Piero simply began to appear at official functions, introduced as Piero Ferrari, his presence normalized through repetition rather than declaration. Those who had known the family understood what had happened. Those who had not were left to draw their own conclusions. But the recognition came with its own burdens. Piero was not Dino. He had not grown up in the house, had not been groomed from childhood to assume the mantle. His relationship with his father was marked by the distance of those early years, the formality that had been necessary for survival. Enzo treated him with respect, with a kind of careful affection, but the bond that had existed with Dino, the intimacy of shared illness and shared purpose, could not be replicated. Piero understood this. He had spent his life watching from the periphery, learning the rhythms of the organization without ever standing at its center. He knew that his role was not to replace Dino, but to preserve what Dino's death had threatened to destroy. The company, the name, the legacy, these were the things that mattered, and Piero accepted his place within that larger architecture. By the 1980s, Enzo's health had begun its final decline. He was in his late 80s, his body failing even as his mind remained sharp. He still held court in the house on Viale Trento e Trieste, still received visitors, still issued the directives that shaped the racing team's strategy. But his appearances grew less frequent, his energy more carefully rationed. The man who had once overseen every detail of the operation now relied on others to execute his vision. The house itself had become a kind of museum, frozen in the aesthetic of an earlier era. The furnishings had not been updated in decades. The technology was minimal. A telephone, a television, little else. Enzo distrusted computers, distrusted the digital revolution that was transforming the world outside his walls. He preferred paper, preferred voices, preferred the tangible evidence of human presence over the abstraction of electronic communication. Visitors who came to pay homage in those final years described an atmosphere of twilight. The rooms were dim, the curtains often drawn. Enzo sat in his usual chair, the dark glasses still in place, his voice softer now, but no less precise. He spoke of the past more than the future, of races won and lost, of drivers who had died young, of the sun whose absence still shaped every day. He did not speak of regret. He did not speak of the choices that had isolated him, the relationships he had sacrificed, the human costs of his single-minded pursuit. If he felt such things, he kept them hidden behind the same walls that had protected him for 90 years. The house was a fortress, and Enzo remained its final defender, guarding secrets that would go with him to the grave. The world outside continued to celebrate Ferrari as a symbol of Italian genius, of speed and beauty and mechanical perfection. But inside the house in Modena, the truth was simpler and sadder. An old man sat alone, surrounded by the artifacts of a life devoted to machines, waiting for an end he had spent decades outrunning. The sale had been coming for years. Enzo understood, even if he refused to admit it publicly, that the age of the independent manufacturer was ending. The capital required to compete at the highest levels of motorsport, to develop new technologies, to meet the regulations imposed by governments and sanctioning bodies, all of it had grown beyond what a family enterprise could sustain. Ferrari needed a partner. Ferrari needed protection. And Enzo, for all his resistance, needed to ensure that what he had built would survive him. The negotiations with Fiat began in the late 1960s. Gianni Agnelli, the heir to the Fiat empire and the most powerful industrialist in Italy, approached Enzo with a proposal. Fiat would acquire a majority stake in Ferrari, providing the financial resources necessary for continued competition, while Enzo would retain control over the racing division and the day-to-day operations of the company. It was, in essence, an offer of immortality, the guarantee that the Ferrari name would continue long after its founder was gone. Enzo resisted. He had spent his entire life avoiding dependency, refusing to submit to the authority of others. The memory of his departure from Alfa Romeo in 1939, when he had been forced out after disagreements with the management, still burned. He had sworn then that he would never again work for someone else, never again allow his decisions to be overruled by men who did not understand what he was trying to achieve. But circumstances had changed. The costs of racing had escalated dramatically. Ford, with its vast resources, had launched an assault on Ferrari's dominance at Le Mans, winning 4 consecutive victories after Enzo had rejected their buyout offer in 1963. British constructors like Lotus and McLaren were investing in technologies that Ferrari could not match without significant capital infusion. The choice was no longer between independence and partnership. It was between partnership and obsolescence. In 1969, Enzo signed the agreement. Fiat acquired 50% of Ferrari, with an option to increase their stake after his death. Enzo retained operational control and, crucially, complete authority over the racing program. The house in Modena remained his. The factory in Maranello remained his to command. But the ownership had shifted, and with it, something intangible had been lost. Those close to Enzo noted a change in his demeanor after the sale. He became more defensive, more prone to invoking his past achievements as evidence of his continued relevance. He spoke often of the early days, of the struggles and sacrifices that had built the company, as though reminding himself, and anyone who would listen, that Ferrari was his creation, regardless of what the corporate documents might say. The 1970s and 80s brought continued success on the track, but also continued tragedy. Drivers died with a regularity that seemed almost medieval. Ignazio Giunti in 1971, François Sever in 73, Jochen Rindt posthumously awarded a championship he never lived to celebrate. Enzo attended none of the funerals. He sent condolences, arranged for support to the families, but he did not stand at the gravesides. The pattern established after Monza held firm. His critics saw this as callousness, as evidence that Enzo viewed his drivers as disposable components in the larger machine of his ambition. His defenders argued that he cared too much, that the deaths affected him so deeply that he could not bear to witness the rituals of mourning. The truth, as always with Enzo, lay somewhere in the shadows between these interpretations, inaccessible to anyone who had not lived inside his particular solitude. The house on Viale Trento e Trieste became increasingly sealed off from the outside world. Security was tightened. Visitors were screened more carefully. Enzo's appearances at the factory grew rarer, his communications conducted primarily by telephone. He was becoming a recluse, a figure more mythological than real, his presence felt through directives and decisions rather than physical encounters. Inside the house, the rituals of daily life continued unchanged. Enzo rose early, reviewed the morning reports, made his calls to Maranello. He took his meals at fixed times, prepared by staff who had served the household for decades. He walked in the garden when his health permitted, always alone, always following the same paths among the cypress trees. The routine was a form of discipline, a structure imposed on days that might otherwise have collapsed into shapelessness. His relationship with Piero deepened during these years, not into intimacy, but into a kind of functional partnership. Piero handled the business matters that Enzo found tedious, represented the family at events that Enzo declined to attend, served as a bridge between the founder and the organization that had grown beyond any one man's capacity to control. It was not the relationship Enzo had imagined having with a son, but it was the relationship that remained possible. Laura's death in 1978 had removed the last obstacle to Piero's full integration into the family structure, but it had also removed something else, the counterweight to Enzo's isolation, the presence that had anchored him to ordinary human obligations. Whatever their difficulties, Laura had been a constant, a witness to decades of triumphs and failures, someone who remembered the man Enzo had been before grief and success had transformed him into something harder to reach. Without her, the house grew quieter still. The staff maintained their routines, the calls from Maranello continued, but the sense of a living household diminished. Enzo was becoming an artifact himself, preserved in a setting that no longer quite belonged to the present, waiting for a conclusion that drew closer with each passing season. The end, when it came, was handled with the same precision that had characterized everything else. Enzo died on August 14, 1988, in the bedroom where he had slept for more than half a century. The announcement was delayed until after his burial, ensuring that no crowd would gather, no cameras would intrude, no spectacle would disrupt the privacy he had guarded so fiercely. He was interred beside Dino in the cemetery of San Cataldo, the two Alfredos finally reunited beneath the Emilian soil. The grave is modest, a simple marker bearing the names, the dates, nothing more. There are no grand monuments, no statues, no eternal flames. The man who built machines, worshipped around the world, chose to disappear into the same earth as any farmer or shopkeeper from the region. The house on Viale Trento e Trieste passed to Piero, who maintained it for years in something close to its original state. The furnishings remained, the photographs stayed on the walls. The garden continued its slow growth beneath the cypress trees. It was as though the residence itself refused to acknowledge that its architect was gone, holding the shape of his absence, like a mold preserving the form of what once filled it. In 2014, the house was transformed into the Museo Enzo Ferrari, open to the public for the first time in its history. Visitors now walk through the rooms where Enzo received drivers and dismissed engineers, where he mourned his son and managed his empire. Display cases hold memorabilia. Audio guides narrate the official history. The fortress has become a tourist destination, its walls breached by the simple passage of time. But something remains inaccessible. The grief that shaped those rooms, the silences that filled them, the weight of decisions made in isolation. These cannot be exhibited. They exist only in the gaps between the artifacts, in the questions that the displays do not answer, in the sense that something essential has been carefully removed before the doors were opened. Enzo Ferrari built machines that embodied